Okay, Assalamualaikum and hi everyone. Good evening to all our viewers wherever you are watching this on our Facebook and YouTube Young Minds Malaysia. How are you today? I hope that you guys are all in the pink of your health. Welcome back to Young Minds Malaysia, where we discuss and share a lot of information, webinars, live talk, conferences, and so on and so forth regarding various topics that focuses on mental health. Before we start, let me just introduce again to our beloved audience here on what is Young Minds. Well, to those who are new and first time to watch us here in Young Minds, well, we are a social enterprise that focuses on the motion to break the stigma among Malaysians so that people who have been suffering will be able to step up again and reach out for help without having the fear of society's label, which I can say that it is improving recently. Our focus would be the youth, and we do provide coaching that will be handled by the professionals to sharpen their skills in regards to mental health. Okay, I'm done with the introduction of Young Minds. So for now, before we deep dive into our topics, let me just introduce myself. My name is Muhammad Shahril Nizam bin Abdullah, third year engineering student, which also served as one of the mental health advocates in Young Minds Malaysia. And today we will be discussing on a topic called Neurodiversity and Inclusivity, the Autism story. Also, as you can see here in our screen at the moment, we have two amazing speakers here, which I will start first with Dr. Sujata. Her full name is Dr. Sujata Dorai Manikam. How are you, Dr. Sujata? Please say something to the audience.
A very good evening, Shahril. Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you, Young Minds, for inviting me for this talk today. My name is Sujata, like you said, and I'm a public health specialist. But my special interest is drama intervention and family intervention. Today's topic is it's very interesting, and I would like to say thank you again for giving us this opportunity to do this. Yeah, thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Doctor. So it's nice to see you again for the second time here with Young Minds. Okay, guys, let me just deep dive a little bit about Dr. Sujata. She is a public health specialist with 24 years of extensive experience in various fields under the Ministry of Health in leading, strategizing, developing, implementing, and reviewing occupational and safety health management plans. Currently, pursuing her passion specializing in creative drama intervention, she is attached to Women and Children Hospital Kuala Lumpur and experienced working in creative workshops for the past 3 years. Her passion is working with children with special needs such as autism, attention deficit hyperactive disorder ADHD, sensory processing issues, depression, and eating disorders. Trained in theatre and hospital clowning by the Little Theatre India, Kuala Lumpur Performing Arts Centre in bracket LGBTQ, Hillary Chaplin USA in bracket improvisation for hospital clowning, Prof. Sue Jennings in bracket UK in the practice of using drama intervention for children and adolescents with mental health issues since 2017. Dr. Sujatha have also been invited to conduct workshops with health care workers by the Ministry of Health, schools, detention homes for adolescents, and beside hospital clowning in pediatric, palliative, and psychiatry wards. And now, let us move on to our second speaker of the day. Please welcome Dr. Anita Kodati. How are you doing right now, Dr. Anita?
Hi, Shahril. Thank
Hi.
you so much for, introducing us and being our host for today. I'm doing great.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Dr. Anita. Nice to meet you here for the first time in Young Minds. Would love to know
Likewise.
more. Would love to know more about your thought on this topic later on throughout the live talk today. Okay. And now, again, guys, let me just intrude some information about Dr. Anita here to all our audience. She is a psychiatrist and currently subspecializing in the child and adolescent psychiatry field. Her areas of interest are child adolescent and family issues such as autism, hyperactivity, and inattention, sensory processing issues, oppositional behavior, learning difficulties, stress, anxiety, and depression, as well as attachment-focused parenting. She advocates for early assessment and intervention with the focus on empowering parents and clients. She is an eclectic practitioner and utilizes cognitive behavioral and mindfulness approaches. She has level 1 experience in interpersonal psychotherapy Prof. Xavier Pereira, Malaysia, drama and neurodramatic play therapy Professor Sue Jennings, UK, and play therapy PT Ost. She is also trained to administer the ADOS2 Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule 2 assessment in UCSF University of California, San Francisco, Star Center, US, which is considered a gold standard assessment tool for autism across the ages of 12 months through adulthood. She has been invited to give lectures in private universities, colleges, and the corporate sector. She has also been invited as an expert panelist in forums, local televisions, and radio talk shows as part of mental health awareness initiatives. She has also presented a few papers at local and international conferences. Okay, alright. I think that is quite informative information that we have here for our beloved speaker tonight. So before we proceed to the next session, I would like to inform to the audience that this session tonight will not just be a session where I could just ask the question and pass it on to our speakers, but it will be a session where our speakers will chit-chat among themselves about our topic tonight, neurodiversity and inclusivity. So, without further ado, I would pass on the floor to our speaker, Dr. Sujatha, to start off this session. Please welcome Dr. Sujatha.
Thank you again so much, Shahril, for the very kind introduction of us. And very good evening indeed to Dr. Anita and to all the audience out there. Okay, I have to say this, it is my utmost pleasure and honor to share this platform with Dr. Anita. And again, I would like to thank Young Minds for giving me this opportunity. Actually, there's a lot of false perception out there with regards to autistic spectrum disorder. So some regard ASD as a remarkable gift and skills, definitely. And some, they even think it's so devastating. They probably think they have this devastating traits. And not necessarily also equal. Some may even think it's a disability. So from my knowledge, I don't think there is a diagnostic manual as such where they can truly explain this multifaceted experience of ASD. So may I ask you, how do you actually explain to someone about this autistic spectrum disorder?
Thank you, Sujata, for the question. I think, likewise, Sujata, I'm honored to share the platform with you and also all our, viewers tonight. And you're right, Shahril did a wonderful job of really introducing us and all our skills. But the question that you ask, how do you sort of talk about autism to, let's say, a family, who brings in usually a child, because we work at the Women and Children's Hospital. And I think the usual story would be a child is brought to us for assessment. And I think it can go two ways. Often the information that we give to the parents after our assessment that we are trained to do, all of us who do child and adolescent psychiatry, we are trained to use certain diagnostic manuals to diagnose. But conveying this diagnosis to parents can sometimes relieve some parents because they feel that they've been searching for such a long time for an answer and they had no idea why their child was so different, and now they know. So they have a feeling of relief, they tell us. And sometimes in the conversation about autism, some parents actually get really, it could range from, denial or being upset, or they're really defensive. They would say things like, if you say that my child has autism, just because he or she spoke a bit late, well, I spoke a bit late too, and right now I'm fine. So I think the experience, in my view, is very different for each family. So telling someone that they have autism can provoke different ranges of responses. And it's very different when you tell an adult. So I also assess, like Shahril said, adults who come with, let's say, anxiety or depression, and they have troubles at work, or, in universities, or even in their own personal lives, like in their marriages and social relationships. And then we realize that they have some certain traits that signify that they could be on the spectrum. And sometimes telling them relieves them as well, because they've been wondering, why are they so different from everyone else? Why is it talking to people so anxiety provoking? Why is it so easy for their friends and not easy for them? And they try so hard to fit in that they've exhausted themselves, At the same time, there are some who understand what you're telling them, because they are able to intellectually, but accepting that they are different is really, really hard, because I guess as a society, we don't make it easy for people who are different to belong. And that's why we're talking about neurodiversity and how that's a concept for us.
Thank you so much for that. Dr. Anita, do you feel there is a vast difference between male diagnosed with autistic or autistic spectrum disorder and the female ASD person? Do you think there's a lot of difference compared to both of them?
Yeah, that's another great question. And the answer is yes. Traditionally, we always believed that autism was more common in boys. And that's probably because it's picked up more easily in boys, because boys tend to have more obvious symptoms that are typical of the diagnosis. For example, they have difficulty in socializing, in communicating. They may have presented, when they were very much younger, with delayed speech. That means they would have spoken late, maybe at the age of 4 or 5. By right, most children should start speaking pretty well at the age of 2 and be able to express themselves verbally, But for females, on the other hand, it's harder to see it, because females tend to have different sort of symptoms. So a very young girl might not have a speech delay. On the other hand, she might be talking, or she would have developed speech, and she would start talking like a little professor, but she would talk, should I say, like one-sidedly. So when we talk about autism, it's all about reciprocity. It's about interaction. It's the back and forth. So a young child may be very talkative, but might be talking about some details about, let's say, their favorite cartoon. But for a young child to keep on going into detail without really engaging the person that she's talking to might signify that the child might have some autistic traits. And so you wouldn't see the typical delayed speech you see in a boy. And then the other thing is about eye contact. So that's one of the most important and, difficult to sometimes pick up, because you see, boys on the spectrum, when they're very young, they do avoid eye contact. And even if they look, they would kind of look from the side and things like that. But girls, on the other hand, I guess it's kind of like the nature of females. They're more compelled to comply and fit in. So, like when you're very young, your mother would say to you, hey, when I'm talking to you, look at me, and things like that. So girls tend to feel that they need to follow, otherwise they would be picked out as different. So sometimes it's hard to see these differences unless you're very well trained and you've seen a lot of patients. Like basically since 2016, I basically see children every single day of my life. And so, there's a different level of training that I have. So even if a child looks at me, I'm able to tell that the gaze is not really what I would say as what I need it to be called normal. And so when these children grow up, it's very interesting that boys tend to still be, more easily diagnosed because they would have less friends. More obviously, they would be loners. They would be living in their own worlds. They would prefer interaction using electronic media. And just a fun fact to throw in, a lot of people will say, like, why is it that children with autism gravitate towards, computer games and social media as their main form of expression? And that is because many of the programmers and people who have created computers, such as, computer programs like Bill Gates and iPhones like Steve Jobs, the late Steve Jobs, and even the very fun to use social media like Facebook, all these people have traits of being on the spectrum. So they've created the platforms that are intuitive for those who are neurodiverse, because the autistic brain is wired differently. Whereas the girls, they tend to camouflage themselves. So like chameleons, if you are familiar with chameleons, they change according to the environment. So in an environment that, let's say, they are teenagers at school, they want to fit in because they see all the girls kind of like, talking about boys and clothes or whatever the conversation is. So they would try their best to fit in. But this is where the problem happens. They start to become very anxious, and this makes them very stressed out. And so sometimes they can just sort of shut down. And of course, the traits evolve over time. So by the time they are adults, it's very hard to say that they are autistic in the sense. But I would say this: the disorder is only when something, disturbs your daily routine, social occupational functioning. So if you're a young child going to school and all that. But as you grow older, you may not have the disorder, but you still are autistic. Like, so I have many friends that I know of who are on the spectrum. They look perfectly fine. They socialize very well on the surface. They've learned to regulate themselves and their emotions. But when you know them very well, then you realize there are hints of things. Like, for example, some of them may have a certain way of eating. They wouldn't want to mix their food, like their food needs to remain separate. If it's mixed, they can still eat it, but it stresses them out. And then they don't like things that are too slimy. Things have to be very specific. But, it doesn't actually cause any problems to anyone. They still can be flexible. They've learned that over the years. So I think we need to keep in mind that girls accommodate themselves really well compared to the boys. And again, when you say spectrum, there are so many factors there. What I'm talking about are usually the children on the spectrum with normal or above average intelligence. But you also have those who may have had some issues during the birth and, because of lack of oxygen, maybe their IQs are lower. And they present with a whole lot of different symptoms, like, repetitive behavior, like hurting themselves and things like that. So it's very hard to really put any one of these people in a box. And I think that's what you were saying earlier, Sujata, that you can't really just come up with a standardized checklist to, diagnose them.
Thank you again. And I'm very curious, like, I know that you have been trained to do adults. How young can you diagnose a child who's on a spectrum?
Okay, great question again. So when we say diagnosis, we have to use a system of diagnosis. So what we recognize in the world are two systems. One is the ICD-10, and version 11 is coming out January next year. And the other one that we commonly use in psychiatry is dedicated towards mental health issues. So it's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and now we are at version 5. Now, what all these versions tell you is that our understanding and therefore classification of symptoms change over time. So let me just take DSM-5. So I told you we're at version 5, but previously we were at version 4, text revised, they call it TR. And so in that version, there was autism spectrum disorder as well as there was Asperger's syndrome. And now they've taken out Asperger's, and now you have in DSM-5 autism spectrum disorder or social communicative disorder. So between these two disorders, there's only one difference. So people who have autism disorder, as per DSM-5, they have restricted or repetitive patterns of interest and behavior. And if you are unable to identify that, but they have difficulties with socializing and communication, then they fall into social communicative disorder. So that is what we use to diagnose. And the ADOS is designed for any child from the age of 12 months and above, right through adulthood. So I've actually diagnosed an autistic person of 80 plus, so it's possible to even diagnose or get a diagnosis even at that age. And the youngest I have personally done myself would be using the ADOS would be around the age of 2 years plus. But you can actually use it if the child is able to walk at 1 year or 12 months, then you can actually use it to diagnose autism. But I want to say this, the features of autism actually are present even from in utero. In utero is even inside the mother's, tummy or uterus, basically. Because a lot of the mothers that we've spoken to, and I think Dr. Sujatha knows some of our clients, they talk about having what we call hyperemesis, which is a severe form of vomiting during early part of pregnancy, or some continue right through the end of pregnancy, And this is not just the usual morning sickness. They really have severe dehydration and things like that. So that could be one of the signs, but this is not like conclusively proven. But basically, there might be some minor signs even, while the child is developing, because you must remember this is neurodiversity even from the child's formation, right? And then you talk about infancy, which is from the time the child is born until the child is 1 year old. There might be signs like a child who has difficulty feeding, drinking, or when you start the soft diet around 6 months, very difficult with feeding, only like specific flavors or textures. And you might also find that difficulty with sleeping patterns. So these might be some of the signs. And a lot of others I spoke to who are very observant, they actually can even tell you that they felt that they had a lack of warmth when bonding with their baby, when the baby is very young, like when they're breastfeeding, the child does not feel as warm as the other children who are maybe not on the spectrum. And so these are all the observations that you can see during early part, So after the age of 12 months, you need a very skilled doctor. But I want to also mention this. In Malaysia, we have what we call primary healthcare clinics, known as Klinik Kesihatan. And they have, as part of the, follow-up of a normal child, as they do the vaccination program and everything. So in that book, they actually have something called the MChat, which is also designed to screen for symptoms or signs of autism. So they usually do it at 18 months, and then they might repeat it at the age of 2 years, so 1.5 to 2 years. So provided that the parents are able to tell the symptoms, then, it might get picked up really early, which is very important for early intervention. The problem usually is that a lot of children are in care with either BBIC or, the helper at home, or even a babysitter. So when the parents bring the children for vaccination, they don't really know a lot of the information, or sometimes children are also taken care by grandparents. So I think this is the difficulty that we have with diagnosis. Yeah.
I would just like to touch a little bit on sensory processing issues, because as far as I know, most of our ASD patients, they come in with sensory issues. What is your take on that, and how do you think that what advice would you give to parents regarding that? Thank you.
Okay, I also love this question. So yeah, a lot of children with autism present with various sensory issues. So sometimes they're very sensitive to sounds like vacuum cleaners, hair dryers. Now, of course, any child, very young child, maybe in a very quiet home, may not really be used to the sound. So they might be a little bit, surprised or something like that. But a child who has autistic traits is not just that. It creates a huge amount of distress, and usually as very young children, they would cry, or they would have a tantrum, or they would hold their ears as if they were in pain. And sometimes it's also simple things like even thunder or loud motorbike passing outside. And a lot of them also have issues with texture, food. So it's also sensory. And then some of them, they like to touch everything. They are, very touchy-feely. They must, it's not just about touching, but it's like they like to feel things. So something soft, they like to rub it. The concept of bantal busuk. I'm not saying that everyone with a bantal busuk has sensory issues, but some children, they have a particular favorite toy or a pillow, but they're not overly distressed when, let's say, the mother throws it into the wash. But children with sensory issue change in the texture, because when you wash, it becomes a bit hard or anything. It's very triggering for them. And it can create a lot of emotional distress. So that's for, things that they touch. And then food, of course, I've had kids that only ate chicken rice for 3 years and cannot accept other things except for, nuggets and fries and a very westernized kind of diet. So, and some of them also have sensory to touch. So either they don't like to be touched so much, or they don't like to be hugged, or they, when they fall, they don't feel so much pain. But you see, it doesn't exist in the same child. That means, the child could have a multitude of these few, it's different for each child. And I think sensory issues are often not addressed enough. And so you were asking, like, what advice you would give to parents. To keep it very simple, I call it kampung therapy. So kampung therapy basically means, I feel that, the shift of modernization. So I years ago, if you ask someone, are you going to balik kampung or something like that? It's like, yes, I'm going to balik kampung. And kampung is a real proper, calm, serene place. Something like Sekinchan, but not so glamorous. It's the simple things, like you have trees, you have the wooden house, and you have the birds singing and all the stuff. The problem that we have now is that we all live in these beautiful modern homes with expensive sofas and or really nice furniture that, we don't have the tolerance when children spill things and drop things, and we don't like children playing in sand and mud because it will dirty our house. Whereas in the kampung house, it's okay. You go and play in the sand, so you can feel and you get all the sensory, senses all fulfilled. You can climb the tree. You can do your balance and coordination. But here, I think if you see children climbing trees, you most likely, the first thought will be like, the parents must be very irresponsible. The child is going to fall. But do you realize that we've taken away the very thing that actually helps us learn? all of us only learned to walk because we fell enough. Then we learned that, okay, we must do this so that we don't fall and hurt ourselves. So even when we fall, there's a way of falling so that it's not so bad, we fall on a bum. Everything is a huge learning curve. And so now you've actually taken away all those things, and then, the child is growing up in a very, sort of sterile environment. And so these sensory issues are so much more prominent. Now, the question I always get is, but not all children have an issue. Well, not all children are differently wired. But again, we need to also think about why we see probably more children on the spectrum these days. It could be that it was always there, but, because we had good kampong therapy, so it's like a very naturalistic early intervention program that you don't have to worry too much, or the child would have had the sensory issues, but it would have been resolved on its own, But now we have to actually create a situation, like do the program in a, contained environment with 4 walls to have the same effect. So that's my take on it.
Okay. Thank you so much. Since we are actually running out of time, a very last question. There are patients that would come in, they be very anxious, and they will actually keep moving and, shaking their legs and, like what you said, touching and rubbing and things like that. What would you advise the parents, because most of us, even me, I guess, when earlier I said, stop shaking your legs, stop doing this, and they would do probably repeatedly will be doing something. So what would be your advice to the parents?
Great question again. I think when we talk about inclusivity as a concept, it's all about accepting the differences. And so we need to think about why the child, what's the function of that behavior? And if we think about it and relate it to what you've said earlier about, or you asked me about sensory processing issues. So sometimes the child needs to self-regulate. So when you actually ask them to sit down quietly, it's against their nature when they're young. We are much better at controlling ourselves when we are older. And that's why we are always stressed up, because we control ourselves too much. So when they're younger, children are as they are, so if you expect them to sit down quietly, you need to probably give them something else to do, like fidget toys that are acceptable and things like that. Because otherwise, it might actually cause them to feel uncomfortable. And that's when sometimes they start doing other things that they can do while sitting down, like touching and, other forms of ways that they can regulate themselves. So the advice I would give parents is that try to sort of celebrate your child's differences. Not everything needs to be stopped or controlled. Parents do that because I guess it's the expectation of society. Like if a child is, moving around too much in a restaurant, well, thank God now it's not a problem for those children, because there's no, people will get upset and things like that. So we try to control our children because of that. Or maybe we were also controlled as kids. We were also told the same thing, and this is what we expect. But moving forward as a society, and when we talk about neurodiversity, in the autism conversation, it's all about accepting the differences, celebrating it. And it's not just about autistic people. When you talk about neurodiversity, we are accepting people with hyperactivity, people with sensory issues. Basically, we are trying to celebrate the differently wired people as compared to the so-called normal people. And I always joke about this. If we were to go to, let's say, Silicon Valley, we would be abnormal because more than 80% of them are on the spectrum. So normality is overrated. And I think we need to think about being, much more open to the idea of including everybody. Every one of us has a very unique talent or value that we bring to society. And a child who is told that, or if we punish a child for their differences, we might actually cause a lot of issues. And if we look at people differently and see the goodness in them, I think we could make a huge change.
Thank you so much for the detailed explanation. I'm sure the audience out there would really, you know, really appreciate what you have explained, and I think we could now probably relate to a lot of things right now. So thank you again so much, Dr. Anita, for the wonderful explanation. And I would like to pass back this thing. I'll pass it back to Mr. Shahril for this for our end of our discussion for today. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Dr. Sujata and Dr. Anita, for your sharing session. I believe the audience out there are right now really understand what does it feels to experience the situation where you have to deal with autistic children, especially when it is your own child, you know. Okay, so yeah, we do have some questions from our audience. Basically, let me just quickly get to our YouTube. From Mr. Alias, he asked me like a question. What is the main difference between Asperger's and autism? Perhaps,
Okay,
Doctor.
so that's a great question. The thing is, it's really about the terms. So Asperger's is a term that came about because there was a physician, in the previous century that sort of identified a group of people who had, autistic-like traits, but they did not have some of the features of. So what features am I talking about? So these people who are usually sort of classified as Asperger's, they communicate well, they can socialize, but they're a little bit awkward. So think about Bill Gates, think about Steve Jobs, think about Mark Zuckerberg. So they are all intelligent people, and then they communicate pretty well, but they might, if you look very closely enough, you might see the awkwardness, or you may not, because they have learned to camouflage themselves. So in the new classification, Asperger's is under autism spectrum disorder. But however, those who have Asperger's, those who are fairly intelligent, they can communicate and they can social of autism. For example, if you really remember Mark Zuckerberg, he wears the same T-shirt and the same jeans. He likes that. That he thrives in certain things that are same. He created Facebook because he had social anxiety, part of the reason, and he wanted a way to categorize and group people together, because then it's easier to make friends that way. Takes away the whole physical social situation. If I go on to Steve Jobs, I think he made the iPhone because of certain, I think he found that he needed to cope with certain things, and he could use the iPhone to actually cope with it. So that's how it came out, all the functions and things like that. He kept on having the ideas because it's part of what makes it easier for him to also do things as a person. Same thing if you talk about programming and things like that. So that's the difference between Asperger's and autism. So what I want to say is that now we actually consider people with Asperger's under autism spectrum disorder. The key difference is if they have an identifiable, repetitive behavior or restricted interests. So restricted interest could be like, I saw a man quite a few years ago. He loves to study bugs. He has a whole collection of bugs. He spends a lot of time with them. I'm a pen enthusiast, and I go for fountain pens, the old school type. And so a lot of the people that I meet in that circle, they are very detailed about their knowledge on fountain pens, the nibs, the sizes. They can tell you the material. So that's their restricted interest. And if you can see, sometimes it's a very normal interest. So sometimes it's a very odd interest, like bugs, but sometimes a very normal interest. They just pay a lot of attention to detail on it. Some people are very detailed about watches, the mechanism, and things like that. So then you can call them autistic. But if they don't have something which is repetitive or restricted interest, you would call them social communicative disorder. It's just a change of terms. But practically speaking, most people who have traits like Asperger's do, they prefer to call themselves and identify themselves as Asperger's.
Okay, all right, right. Thank you so much. And we also have another question about autism. Okay, how Miss this is from Miss Ika Zulkifli. She asked like my child case is genetic, and can we tell which side of family the autism came from?
This is so interesting, but and it's very long answer, to be
Okay.
honest. But I'm not going to go into the full detail of it. I think maybe Sujata, we can save it for another session. But the short answer would be this: there is a strong genetic link. So what we say hereditary. So usually when we see a child with autistic traits, we are fairly sure that either parent or both parents sometimes have similar traits because they are our children. So how can they be very different from us? They have to share something similar to us in terms of behavior. Am I right? So the part that I talked about earlier in tonight's conversation is that as people with autism are not obvious, it's very camouflaged. So even they may not realize that they're actively camouflaging it. It's just by habit. They don't know I'm going to camouflage because, whatever. It's a very natural thing for them, but they don't realize it. So usually the diagnosis for the parents comes after I see the child. Then I start to ask the parents, so when you were young, did you have delayed speech? When you were young, did you speak very early, and did people say that you were a chatterbox and maybe you had an American accent, which is one of the common things that we see in young children? And so then I start to see, and then they would tell us that, oh, actually I don't like it when people change my schedule, or pop up from suddenly from somewhere, or give me a project and then last minute give me a lot of different details. I mean, I still do it, but there's a lot of distress. They're not so adaptive. So things like that. So if you're talking about genetic tests, like, Down syndrome, you can diagnose with a genetic test. We do not have a genetic test to diagnose in that sense. But how we diagnose is actually to talk about how the experience of growing up would be in their own families. So then we can get the information. And I also want to leave you with this. A very famous researcher about Asperger's, Tony Edward. His name is Tony Attwood. He, in one of his talks, and I quote him, there are 4 professions that are highly associated with Asperger's or autism spectrum disorder, which is doctors, engineers, IT professionals, and accountants. Maybe lawyers too, but he didn't say that, Why is this so? Well, that's the part that I think we need to save for another talk, because there is something called the intergenerational trauma concept. So that is about growing up experiences that can be traumatic from, let's say, your grandparents to the parents to the child. So, that is one of the other theories that is associated. But that I don't want to confuse it with today's topic.
Okay, okay, all right. Thank you so much, Dr.Anita. I think we all right now can see that this is when we want to see if this is genetically made. I mean, for the autistic children to experience this by genetic, it's like a broad topic that, and you also mentioned that like some carriers might have this kind of issues. So one of it is engineer, and I'm also an engineering student. So I might afraid if I could have that or somehow related to that. So I would love to see more discussion on this. So to all the viewers, this is not the end of our session for today. We will be having a lot more session after this that in regards to autism. So do stay tuned with us for more after this. And Dr. Anita, I think we can take one last question from the audience. It is from Mr. Yusri Aspansha. It's more towards the research part. The question goes like, what progress has been made so far in autism research? Can you please explain to us on this?
Okay, the research in autism is so wide, and it's gone from, genetics. Again, it's in every aspect of it, because I think for the past, since the 90s, so we're talking about, yeah, 30 years, I think there has been so much of research on diagnosing, on genetics, on how do you do early intervention program, what is effective, what is not, how do you, help those who are, approaching adulthood and things like that. But from all of this, and in fact, this recent years, there's been a lot of research on families, families with trauma, and how some of it might be related to some of the autistic features that we see. So that, like I said, is another topic. So the research has been really extensive. But what it tells us at the end of the day is that it's very hard to put a single person into a box, which is why I like to quote another expert. Her name is Marilyn Montero, and she works closely with Tony Edward. She says that, having autism is like a personality, a personality trait. It's just that you're differently wired. It doesn't make you, defective or having an illness. It should be embraced, and we need to educate people to not be afraid of it. Because I think there's always a lot of fear that I see, even in parents, like, I'm so worried if my child is autistic. Why is there so much of worry? Because, put it this way, we wouldn't be having this conversation on a computer, virtually, if there were no autistic people in the world. We wouldn't have our trusty iPhones. We wouldn't have so many things. And I think we need to be aware that everybody makes a difference and brings meaning to our lives. I think the fear is a lot about acceptance and, whether people understand. And I think that is where the real work is. So in terms of, if the question is about curing autism, I hope that the message is clear. I think if you cure autism, you'll be doing the world and everybody in the human race a great injustice, because they are such special people. It's just that instead of us forcing them to understand just our world, for those of us who are not so-called non-autistic, we should also make an effort to go to their world and see things from their eyes.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Dr. Anita, for the clear answer. So right now, I can say that people right now should be, be accepting those children who are having autistic disorders. So yeah, I think there's a lot more for us to talk about on this topic, right? But um, how I mean, we should be doing more of this after this. So I hope that the audience stay tuned with Young Minds Malaysia after this, because we are going to have a lot more talk about autism topics after this with Dr. Anita and Dr. Sujata. So basically, before we end, I would like to say thank you so much to Dr. Anita and Dr. Sujata. With that being said, I would like to thank you, Dr. Sujata and Anita, once again, and to all the viewers for joining us today for our live talk. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at My Young Minds. Till then, see you again. I am Shahril Nizam, and I'm done speaking. Thank you, everyone. Good night, and Assalamualaikum. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.